Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Change. My name is Debbie, and I'm here answering your questions on organizational change management. Today's question really revolves around communication plans, right? I've seen the email with a link to training all too often, and as we all know, that rarely works to get the maximum results you want. So I had this question come in about tips for designing an effective communication plan. Noting that they still use email as the main form of communication, but they've noticed that their open rates and their read rates have declined, which in turn has resulted in users not taking the action that they need them to take to implement a change that they have going on. So they're asking, what tips do you have for designing an effective communication plan? So let's take a look. So the first thing I always like to acknowledge is that while email is absolutely still the most common way that organizations communicate broadly out to their organization, it's not the only way to communicate. Almost every organization, if not every organization, now has multiple channels within their organization to communicate out to their employees. So here's where you want to start getting creative, really thinking about different ways that you can communicate to your users. And the other thing you want to do is align your communications plan to your company culture. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you're a smaller organization, maybe a more progressive organization, or you've adopted, let's say, Yammer posts or blogs or newsletters or posters or digital signage, if you've adopted some of these ways to make announcements right out to your users, use that. Use that when you're communicating a change. You don't have to limit just to email. So understand your culture within your organization. How do you communicate out to your users? Do you do all hands meetings? Do you send out blog posts? Think about different and creative ways for communicating. And a lot of us every day use text messaging, right, on our mobile devices. That's what we use. And most organizations now have texting software or meeting software that they can use. So leverage that. Leverage that in your organization. You're no longer limited to just email. And what I advise customers to do, I like the rule of threes, right? So I always say, you can use email, but repeat that message, right? Take your email message and repeat it across 3 platforms. And what I mean by that is maybe you have your email messaging that you send out to all of your users, but you can also take that same copy that you have in your email and you push it out through a blog post. Maybe you send it as a text message. You send it through an all hands meeting. You put it in digital signage. You have to be creative. Gamification. There's so many different ways that you can communicate out to your users. So know your culture, know where people, I should say, are going for information. Intranet sites are another place that organizations set up to post announcements. So think about that. And then it's not about creating different messaging that actually confuses users. Very often I hear organizations say, well, isn't it redundant to take the same message and put it in 3 different locations? Yeah, it is, but you want it that way. If you were to come up with a completely different message, people would think, wait, is there multiple changes? Is this something different? What is this talking about? I thought I heard this over here, and now you're telling me something different. So take your message and repeat it across platforms. And again, I like the rule of threes. I say do at least 3 different ways to communicate to your users. And make sure the value messaging that you're putting in your communication matches the recipient. And what do I mean by that? I have seen way too many organizations write their communications from the executive perspective, meaning that they'll send a message out to their employees that say, hey, everyone, we're switching up this process or we're moving to a new technology because it's going to save our organization so much money and it's going to increase your productivity. Really? What user wants to hear you don't think they're being productive enough? And what user wants to hear, oh, well, you're going to save money, but you're not giving me a raise in my paycheck, so why should I care? Right? You have to relate that value messaging to why the end user, the recipient of that message, is going to care. So you really have to approach that communication and that message from the user perspective and build in that value messaging. The other thing I invite you to do is what I call taking the scroll test. I have seen organizations create communications, and it's like they wrote a book. You know, it should be broken out into chapters. The email just scrolls on forever, or the blog post just scrolls on forever, or there's different links and they have to click to the next page and then they click. It's like different chapters within a book, and it's super complicated. And that's when you lose people. Even if they open the email, if they have to scroll and they say, oh my gosh, this is going to take me 20 minutes to read, guess what? They're not going to read it. So take the scroll test. When I look at an email, and I do this when someone sends me an email. When I look at an email, if I have to scroll more than once, right? So you scroll down, that's kind of my limit. If I have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll, I might read the first paragraph and then say, is this really worth me reading on or not? Or sometimes I lose interest before I even get started. And I've received a lot of marketing messages from other organizations, advertisers, and things like that, and it turns me off to it before I even get to read it. So take the scroll test. You don't have to communicate every last detail in your communications. Honestly, I would rather see 3 communications that are moderate in length versus one really long communication. So space it out if you have to break it up. You don't have to go into every last detail in your communications, but make sure it's not long enough where you're going to lose interest before you even get users to read through the message. And then really important, I see organizations when they're rolling out new processes, new technology changes, or operational changes, they wait until they're absolutely ready for users to make the change, whatever that change is, and that's when they start communicating. And that's when you actually get a lot of pushback, because you're trying to say, hey, we're ready for you to make this change, but users haven't had time to assimilate to what that change actually is. They haven't had time to digest that change and understand what it's all about and where they go for information. And immediately, bam, you're asking them to take action on it. So every communication plan needs to have a before, during, and after. You want to start communicating well in advance of the change. Let users know what's happening, when it's happening, why it's happening. Fill them in on the details. It helps them feel like they're being brought on the journey with you, which is one of the key ways you can reduce resistance to change, versus just being pushed to do something at a specific time. So communicate before, build in a few communications. Now, depending on the change, I might see 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in advance. Maybe you have 2 communications, maybe you have 6. Again, it's going to depend on what change or changes you're going through, but you want to communicate before the change. Let users accept it, let users be able to ask their questions, so that by the time you get to the during phase of the change, right, which is basically when you're asking them to make the change, users have already accepted it and they're ready to start actually taking action. And then after the change, make sure you have a communication or 2 to follow up. This is a great place to ask a survey, right? What did you think of the change? How did it go? How are you doing? What else can we do to support you? So you want to make sure there's some follow through as well. So it's not just about the point in time of an email with that link to training, like, hey, we're making this change, go take training, go do it. It's the before, here's what we're changing, here's why, here's when. It's the during, now it's time to take action. And it's the after of, how did we do? How did it go? What else can we do to support you? And really important, when you're making a big change or have multiple changes going on, I always like to run a pilot. Most big changes, whether it's a technology change, an operational change, organizations will run a pilot beforehand, right? I say include your communications as part of that pilot group. So send those actual communications that you're planning on sending to a broader audience, send them to your pilot users and ask them to give you feedback on that messaging. Did it resonate? Was it too long? Did it make sense? Was it the right depth of a call to action? Because that it's not only a pilot to test the process or the technology that's changing, it's a way for you to test out and pilot your messaging, your training, your support strategy as well. So pilot your communications before a big broad rollout as part of your overall pilot. All right, so I wanted to share really quickly just a sample of what a messaging layout might be. Now, this is an email. Obviously, this could be a blog post or anything like that as well. You always want to have an action verb in the subject line. Action requested, please note, please read, some way that you're telling users that they need to do something as part of the message. And then in your intro paragraph, this is where you want to lead with that value messaging, that empathetic message, that relatable message, followed by whatever the vision is for the change. Like, hey, we know the last few months have been challenging. Our vision, we want to bring everyone together. We want to, be more successful when we support each other. We are stronger. That is how we're going to get ahead. Then you want to have the body of the message. This is where you're discussing the what's in it for me, the value messaging. This is where you're iterating. What is the change? When is it changing? What's changing? And all of that specific information. Always, always, always have a call to action. Even if your call to action is only reach out if you have questions. Right? Maybe you're not ready for them to take action yet, but you say, reach out if you have questions, go read up more on this new tool, whatever that is. Always make sure there's something for the user to do. You want every communication to be an active communication, not a passive communication. And then lastly, when you're sending, make sure the sender is from a specific content, not those big broad reach robo type emails. Sometimes those end up in a junk folder. And if it just comes from like your IT department, that's a lot of the time when users don't read them because they think, oh, this is just some blanket big communication. It's really not anything I have to pay attention to. But if it comes, let's say, from your CEO or comes from your manager or something like that, you're much more inclined to read it. So follow this, just type of template as you're building out your communications. It really does help drive some of that readability and acceptability from your users. Great. So I hope I was able to share some tips in building out your communication strategy for a change that's happening in your organization. As always, would love to hear what you're up to. So if you have any tips that you'd like to share, anything that's worked for you or that works for your organization, feel free to add those to the comments below. As always, if you like these videos, please like them, subscribe to this channel. It helps me understand what type of information you'd like to see moving forward, what's working for you. And if you have a question you'd like me to consider for a future video, simply submit that at aka.my/question. And with that, we are wrapping up another episode of Let's Talk Change. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Logging off for today. Thanks so much, everyone.